Hello, good night. Welcome to Conversation with Rickford Burke. Of course, this is Rickford here in New York. Share the link, everybody. Get into all your Guyanese groups, share the link, get on Twitter, get on your emails, get on WhatsApp, get on IG, everywhere you can, share the link. Um, Welcome to the New York studios of Conversation with Rickford Burke. Text me, let me know where you're watching from. Good night. I'm seeing those messages. Wow, I have 135 messages already. Thank you guys. Onasa Ward, Dean, good night. Samantha Porter, good night. Where are you watching me from, Samantha? Miss Doreen Clark, watching from Delaware. Norma Jones, good night. Debbie Collins, good night. Text me, let me know where you're watching from. Share the link, everybody. Get in all of your groups. Wake up the people in Essequibo. Of course, it's 9:04 p.m. here in New York and on the East Coast of the United States, Eastern Standard Time. On the Pacific Coast, California, etc., Washington, Oregon, etc. If you have Guyanese there, tell them to tune in. It's now 7:04. If you're watching me from London, good night, my brother, Mr. Milton English in Maryland. Um, Golden Grove man, we grew up together. Text all the folk in Essequibo, Bartica, everywhere else, let them know that Conversation with Rickford Burke is on. We have a very interesting topic tonight. We'll be talking to Dr. Gary Best, the former Chief of Staff of the Guyana Defense Force, Rear Admiral Gary Best, Dr. Gary Best, and we'll talk about the prospects of Venezuela invading Guyana. And we look at analysis of both in the international media as well as an analysis of the performance of the government of Guyana. Keep sharing the link, everybody. Share the link, share the link, share the link. We want to get a couple of thousand people here. I see 1,100 people watching, and we want to get it to 11,000. So come on, everybody, share the link. Good night, Carmen Bethune, watching from New York. Good night, Deborah Lynch. Good night, Riri Mingo. I think that's it. Mingo Garway. Mr. Hamilton, New Jersey. Good night, sir. Chevon McDonald, good night. I see somebody watching from the Bronx. Christoph in New Jersey. Mark Rodriguez watching from watching from Guyana. I saw somebody in Cleveland, Ohio, Miss Thomas from Queens. These messages fly, so it's hard to read them. Upstate New York, Tyrone Haley. Good night, sir. Thank you for watching. Hatton from Brooklyn, Corinne Day. Corinne, you just call me Tickford. Francis from the Bronx. David Watson, California. Daniel Sambels, Bronxville. Be careful. I saw there was a shooting in Bronxville this afternoon. Somebody was shot in the head. Keith Ben, watching from Florida. Good night, everybody. Keep sharing the link. Share the link. Share the link. Share the link, everybody. Okay. I'll be back in about 60 seconds. Keep sharing the link, everybody. Brenda Casey, good night. I'll be back in 60 seconds. Share the link. All right, keep sharing the link, everybody. Good night again. Keep sharing the link. Um, I'm doing the same thing. Again, text me, let me know where you're watching from. We're just trying to get some things situated here. Responding to someone. All right, I'm waiting Dr. Bess. And once he gets on, we'll get started. Text me, let me know again where you're watching from, how you're doing. Dr. Bess is going to be on shortly. So let me update everybody on where we are with this Venezuela situation. As you guys know, when Guyana was a British colony, this dispute was settled in 1899 via an arbitrary award. Venezuela has since claimed that Essequibo belongs to them. And in 1966 in Geneva, the United Nations facilitated an agreement between the British government, the Guyana government, and Guyana was still a colony, not a colony, sorry, it was a British territory, and the Venezuela. As a matter of fact, there was an agreement signed, let me see, excuse me. This agreement was signed on the 17th of February, 1966. For the government of the United Kingdom, you had Michael Stewart, the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, LFS Burnham, the Prime Minister of British Guyana, and for the Venezuelan government, Mr. Ignacio Borges, Minister of Foreign Affairs. And his brother, by the way, the ambassador in England, who also witnessed this signing ceremony, his brother at the time was the president, I think, the president of Venezuela. I could be mistaken. But this agreement basically set out the process for any resolution of Venezuela's concerns. So this territorial boundary between Venezuela and British Guyana was settled in 1899, centuries ago. 1899, and it was settled via an arbitrary award. Venezuela accepted it. Venezuela, as a matter of fact, was boasting that they got the territory west of the Orinoco River, and that's what they wanted. That's why they went into this arbitration. That's what they wanted. They got what they wanted. I guess over the years, Venezuela realized that Essequibo had a lot of resources, and so they got greedy. They started to say, "Oh yeah, Essequibo belongs to us," and they continued this crazy grudge and greed over Essequibo, and they continued through all of these decades to educate their population that Essequibo belongs to them. So from the nursery school children in Venezuela, they grew up knowing that Essequibo belongs to them. And so Maduro now wants to champion this cause because he's very unpopular. The president of Venezuela now, Nicolas Maduro, is very unpopular. And so he wants to become the Venezuelan national hero. He wants to be the man on a mission to recapture, quote unquote, Essequibo, so to speak, on behalf of the Venezuelan people. So he started this saber rattling. But it is because he is very unpopular in Venezuela. And the Venezuelan opposition leader is more popular than him. She won the nomination to be the presidential candidate for the opposition, and he banned her from running. The international community is trying to pressure him to lift that ban. We'll talk about that later. But also, he decided to have a referendum. He is having a referendum because he thinks that the referendum is going to give him, keep sharing the link, everyone, a mandate to come and seize Essequibo by force. And that's one of the questions he had on the referendum. Whether or not the people of Venezuela authorize him to come and seize Essequibo by force. As if some political showmanship in Venezuela has any international effect, has any legitimacy on another country. I mean, it's bizarre, right? How suppose we decide to have a referendum in Guyana and said, we will seize all of Essequibo. We will mobilize international troops and charge to Essequibo and we'll seize Caracas. Is that Biden? Right? So it doesn't make any sense. So that's where we are. We had this referendum. The referendum was held on the 3rd of December, which is last Sunday. They claim 11 million people voted. People are doubting that. The international press that's present in Venezuela said that people hardly showed up to vote. The opposition was against it. Obviously, the opposition supporters didn't go out and vote. But he's claiming 10 million people voted, and so he has a mandate to come and seize Essequibo. Let's take a look at a report from the international media on the referendum in Venezuela.
A day after Venezuela's authorities said voters had overwhelmingly approved the takeover of an oil-rich region in neighboring Guyana, a victorious President Nicolás Maduro vowed to abide by the will of the people and attacked those, he said, were trying to undermine the results.
To the right-wingers who support ExxonMobil, the financed right wing that supports the rights of Guyana and not those of Venezuela, I tell them we are moving forward. This referendum is binding and I will comply with the mandate of the people. The people's voice is sacred. The voice of the people is the voice of God.
I'm not sure. Can you guys let me know if you were hearing that? I wasn't hearing it. Can somebody text me, let me know if you guys were hearing that report? Anyone? Text me, let me know if you guys were hearing the report. Yes, you heard it. Okay, so let's listen to the report.
A day after Venezuela's authorities said voters had overwhelmingly approved the takeover of an oil-rich region in neighboring Guyana, a victorious President Nicolás Maduro vowed to abide by the will of the people and attacked those, he said, were trying to undermine the results.
To the right-wingers who support ExxonMobil, the financed right wing that supports the rights of Guyana and not those of Venezuela, I tell them we are moving forward. This referendum is binding and I will comply with the mandate of the people. The people's voice is sacred. The voice of the people is the voice of God.
Venezuelan election authorities said 95% of the 10.5 million votes they have counted were in favor of creating a new Venezuelan state in the Essequibo, a densely forested region that Venezuela says was stolen when the border was drawn more than a century ago. But some Venezuelans remain skeptical.
Everything they said is a lie, because I passed by several polling centers and everything was always empty. I don't know where they got that number of people who supposedly voted for the Essequibo.
The government promoted the referendum for weeks, calling it an act of patriotism and using it as a way to gauge Maduro's support ahead of next year's presidential election. Venezuela's long claimed the area, but tensions only increased after large deposits of oil were found in 2015. On Monday, the U.S. State Department said it supported a negotiated settlement.
We support a peaceful resolution of the border dispute between Venezuela and Guyana. The 1899 award determined the land boundary between Venezuela and Guyana should be respected unless or until the parties come to a new agreement or a competent legal body decides otherwise. This is not something that will be settled by a referendum.
It's unclear what steps the Venezuelan government will take to follow through on the result. but any action is likely to be met with international condemnation. In the meantime, Maduro's rhetoric is keeping Guyana on edge. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera.
All right. I assume you guys heard somehow I was getting the feedback. Something was blocking it in the studio here. Text me, let me know if you guys all heard that report. Let me bring in Dr. Bess. Dr. Bess, good night.
Good night. Good night. Can you hear me?
Thanks for joining the program. Were you able to hear that report?
Yes, I was able to hear it. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. So, okay, good. I heard it previously, so I know what the report says. What is very interesting about that report, well, several things, but the first thing I want to jump at is Matt Matthews there, somebody we all know. He's a Democratic communications specialist. He is now the spokesperson at the State Department. I think previously he was at the Justice Department. Well, Matthew just said there that the United States is encouraging that this matter be settled through be dealt with through a peaceful resolve, through peaceful settlement. I'm not sure, did he misspeak, or is that some sort of strategic communication there?
It's a good point you raised there, Rick. I'm not sure. I think the U.S., if you recall, when the U.S. ambassador to the OAS, when he made that presentation, he mentioned, among other things, bilateral discussions. But I think it's important to note, as far as Guyana is concerned, the matter is before the ICJ. We have exhausted bilateral discussions and negotiations, but the U.S. seemingly keeps bringing it back. I don't know if that's a strategic message or intended to be some strategic ambivalence on the part of the U.S. But as far as Guyana is concerned, and Guyanese ought to be concerned, the matter is at the ICJ, and there's no pulling back of that matter back to bilateral negotiations. So it tends to sound a bit awkward when it comes from such a high-level official in the United States. I'm not sure what's the end game, but perhaps it's a misspeak, or it's a deliberate speak. But as far as we're concerned in Guyana, and Guyanese ought to be concerned, the matter is before the ICJ for final adjudication on not the border, on the validity of the 1899 award. I think we can take away from his statement that the U.S. is saying, listen, that award is valid, and until such time as it is changed by the ICJ, and stop right there. He went on to suggest if the parties have negotiations, but that part is out.
Right, and the reason why it concerns me is if the United States is such an important strategic partner, they should be articulating what Guyana's position is and what international law is, which is what you said. International law is the agreement is binding unless it's changed by the international court. So there's no room for negotiated settlement by the two parties. So I don't think it's a deliberate speak. It creates too much ambivalence.
Well, you're right in a sense, but the United States is they speak differently. It's international diplomatic language, right? And it's the U.S. we're dealing with. We have to remember that the U.S. eased sanctions against Venezuela so that Chevron can begin pumping oil. And of course, the oil prices are very important to the United States. That is what pushes inflation up. And the Biden administration is very much concerned with the high inflation. So I think they want as much oil being pumped out of Guyana and Venezuela to ensure that this coming Christmas and into the first quarter of the new year, at least they can see the inflation going down. And of course, Biden is going into an election next year. So I think all those moving parts are important. So perhaps that's why we're hearing that's all the language coming from the U.S. But as I said, it's important for us to know here in Guyana that the matter has gone past negotiations. And as I emphasized before, and I reiterate, at no point in time the Geneva Convention was ever meant to settle the border issue because it was already settled. It was meant to deal with the controversy. And the controversy arose because a gentleman named Mali Provost stated after he died that there was some collusion. And he didn't say anything while he was alive. That is the controversy. That's why it's called a border controversy. And therefore, it's important to recognize that at no point in time, the two countries could have resolved that controversy because you have to bring evidence, and evidence has to go in a court of law. So I believe, as I said before, that Venezuela was checkmated by the Geneva Agreement. They couldn't come out of it because there's nothing but Essequibo in it. There's nothing but the land border, only the controversy, and that could not have been solved by the Geneva Agreement. And I think they found that out subsequently and kept pressing for bilateral relations only as a means of solving it. And of course, under the Geneva Agreement, we resorted to the UN Secretary General, who put the matter before the ICJ, and that's where the matter is right now. So coming back to the United States, maybe it's a broad speak geopolitically for the United States, but in the context of Guyana, that matters with the ICJ, and that's where the matter will be resolved.
Correct, and there is a clause in the Geneva Agreement that says that, in effect, the status quo with regard to Guyana and Venezuela remains, and that this issue, the agreement was specifically to deal with Venezuela's concerns. It didn't at all touch the 1899 agreement. But I want to ask you if you don't have a different take also on the United States relaxation of sanctions and the UN. It's both the US and the UN, I guess they act in concert, of sanctions against Venezuela as an incentive for free and fair elections and possibly to maneuver the Maduro administration out of power. Do you think that could be at play as well?
You were breaking up from time to time, so I heard you in broken parts. I don't know why your audio, if you hear me clearly, your audio is coming through in broken parts to me from time to time.
Oh, I'm hearing you very
easing of sanctions.
I'm hearing you very clearly.
I know, but I'm the one. I'm hearing you from time to time broken. But
I gather audience, can you text me? Let me know while these guys check and see if there's an issue. Let me know if you guys are hearing me clearly. Audience, let me know if you guys are hearing me clearly. What I was saying is,
I think I got a gist, because just in case I don't hear you clearly, I got a gist. An easing of sanctions against Chevron at the same time for Maduro to have free and fair elections, whether or not we ought to have a position on it. I think my view is geostrategically, I think in the context of Guyana, it may well be that we should watch and wait this one out. I understand the concern that sanctions are being eased, but remember there was the recent trade between Hess and Chevron. There was a buyout. So Exxon main competitor, Chevron, for example, is now operating and can operate within Guyana waters. So I think when you look at how those multinational companies are focused on how they're operating, where they're going with their interests, and the interest now really is in that basin. And the basin stretches from Suriname to Guyana and now to Venezuela. So I think we have to understand the politics of petro-politics we have to understand in Guyana. That's what our diplomats have to understand. What is petro-politics, how the petrodollar came into being, why the petrodollar is so important, and the fundamental underpinning of the US economy in relation to the petrodollar. I think that's what we have to understand, and we'll have a better position, or diplomats, so to speak, when we're out there speaking, because this is a matter for our diplomats. I know we're going to talk about the recent Maduro expressions, right? And that is an area for our diplomats. So diplomats have to understand economics, politics, petro-diplomacy, among others. But I don't think that is something that Guyana had enough information to really go after by saying US should not ease sanctions. I don't think we had enough information to really...
Should we have strategically express an objection, at least state an objection to the United States publicly that the US is easing sanctions? We are a very important strategic geopolitical partner of the United States in the region, in the hemisphere, and Venezuela had been saber rattling, and not only that, they were warmongering. The rhetoric and the actions were bellicose. So shouldn't we have expressed serious reservation to the United States that, here, listen, if you guys are going to go ahead and lift sanctions against Venezuela, then it should be on condition that Venezuela does not attempt to interfere in Guyana's territorial integrity?
Well, at the back end, yes, but at the front end now, what we're hearing clearly from the State Department is that this matter cannot be solved by a referendum in Venezuela. And I'm taking that to mean that the US government is very clear that the 1899 arbitral award is final, full and final, until such time is changed. And we can take that as a measure of support internationally, even though Guyana did not express open concern or objection to the easing of sanctions against Venezuela. I'm not sure if Guyana was even informed. And ex post facto, perhaps it may not have wanted to speak about it ex post facto. But as I said, the statement from the State Department, less that part of negotiations, is still a good statement, still a strong statement. But we have to operationalize that now. Our diplomats have to operationalize that statement by the U.S. State Department. That's for our diplomats to now take into the various capitals. And I'm happy to hear the president said they spoke with Cuba, because that was mentioned by Dr. Corton, first by Dr. Corton and then myself, that we should talk to Cuba. I'm happy to hear they've spoken to Cuba. I'm also happy to hear so much has happened, and only because of CBS News that we're learning about this in Guyana.
We're going to come to that. But before we come to that, I want to ask you this. Keep sharing the link, everyone. You have a very particular skill, expertise. You're the former Chief of Staff of the Guyana Defense Force, and also you have academic experience and other expertise. Has the government consulted you? Has the Chief of Staff consulted you? Are you satisfied, even though the government is talking about national unity, that they're being divisive? Every Thursday, Bar Jagdale indulges in the most nasty, divisive rhetoric, calling Cathy Hughes, a member of parliament, a lowlife, attacking black leaders as criminals. They had one initial meeting and the opposition pledged support because it's a national issue, but the opposition has not been involved in any of the planning or participation formally in these activities because the government has not included them in the national activities. Do you think that fosters national unity? Is the government making a mistake? Does the government realize that their inclusion of their political slogan, One Guyana, rather than the motto, is creating more division than it is bringing people together? What's your take on all of that?
Rick, unfortunately, I'm hearing you intermittently, but I don't know what's happening with the sound.
Are you using a headpiece?
No.
You're not? Wow.
No.
So let me take it to the stage. Are you hearing me now? Well, the audience is saying they're hearing me very clearly.
Right. It might be my end, which something I can't solve immediately. I don't know why that is.
Okay, so let me ask you in pieces.
I got the gist of your question, though.
Okay, go ahead.
I was not consulted by the government in this issue at any point in time. In fact, I was invited to speak at the Bishops' Forum and then disinvited politely from that forum. So I consider that some sort of political intervention. So I didn't speak at the Bishop Forum. The government, and I said it and I say it again, the government cannot do this all by itself. The opposition is an integral part of government and governance, and that's as per the Constitution. So I do not believe the government is dealing with this matter as per Constitution, and of course, they're not dealing with the matter as per Convention. I think it believes that it has a mandate to govern, and that means it should exclude all other parties. And that is a miscalculation by the government and a misrepresentation of the Constitution. So in my opinion, the government is one-siding this issue, and we don't have a multinational approach, a multi-party approach to it, neither a multi-expertise support it. We have a lot of persons in Guyana with expertise, particularly past Defense Force senior officers, past diplomats in this area. And again, I don't think the government is dealing with this matter expeditiously. But as you said just now, if the questions come in small bursts, I wouldn't miss too much. I don't know what's happening with my son.
Right. Let me follow up on the Guyana the Defense Force ex-senior officers. A lot of them have told me they have not been involved. Do you have confidence in the competence and the ability of the current Chief of Staff to handle this matter alone without calling, for instance, all of the other former Chiefs of Staff and the senior heads to put their heads together to determine how best, or what's the best strategy to deal with this issue?
I think by himself, as he is Chief of Staff right now, he will discharge his duties to the level of the competence he has. But I would say, definitely,
that's diplomatic speak. Go ahead.
If you were to involve the former chiefs and other senior officers, that would bring more weight to what he is doing, because we're just in an advisory capacity based on our expertise, our experience. it cannot. It can only help the chief of staff and the officers if he engages former chiefs and former senior officers. And the other thing I want to mention, which I think is very important for our listeners, is that the leader of the opposition ought to be briefed by the president personally and professionally on this matter. If the government were to change tomorrow,
on an ongoing basis,
it would be awkward if the government were to change tomorrow that the new government doesn't have an understanding of what is happening with national defense or what discussions are being made. The clearance, the security clearance of the leader of the opposition is higher than any other besides the president. I understand the president and his cabinet will have a security clearance information, but the security clearance of the opposition is extremely high. So there's no way under convention, good practice, and good governance that the opposition leader can be left out, because that is the alternative government. And I think it's another miscalculation by the PPP at this moment in leaving out the leader of the opposition. So if we start from there, we'll get to the right ending. The fact that we're not starting from there, you have other technical and specialist people involved in available as a pool to the government that they're avoiding or simply not engaging. And that is not helpful to Guyana. It's not all hands on deck.
People are observing that the government believe the PPP, whenever the PPP is in power, they shut out everybody else who don't subscribe to their politics or their political party, and they govern the country as if it belongs to them. It's their personal property. I'm hearing somebody saying there. How do we as a nation overcome this malicious politics where they only govern for their ethnic supporters and the few others that support them? How do we overcome this even at this time of crisis? And I heard but let me answer the question. Let you answer the question first.
Well, it's a hard question and an easy question. I'll answer the easy part. Really, the easy part is we have to change the government. The easy part, we have to have a change in government. A government that takes over understands how to manage the economy, understands how to marshal defense. If you don't fence your territory, you don't fence your yard, how can you really develop it? We can't have this development we're talking about if we don't have a safe and secure Guyana. And I might say that people are not feeling safe in Guyana right now. Confidence is low in the government, particularly since you're hearing messages that some senior officers of the government thought about giving an ease into the Atlantic to the Venezuelans. So that is not inspiring confidence. I heard the president this morning, yes, but he made some statements again. He didn't sound as though he had any confidence in the defense force. He didn't even mention it. He mentioned it only to the end. He did not even mention Brazil.
He mentioned the U.S.
Those are things that are of concern to me. I'm not sensing that concern.
To follow up on what you said there, Venezuela has a very powerful international media campaign. Most of the media reports are based on Venezuela, based on what Maduro says, based on the referendum. And they're treating it as if it's an illegitimate national exercise. When it's a puppy show, it's a Mickey Mouse maneuver by Maduro to gin up jingoistic a stringent spirit in Venezuela, a spirit of nationalism, and so as to gin up his own political support. Are we making a mistake by not having an equally powerful international communication strategy?
Well, I don't want
so
to.
that the world can see what Venezuela is doing as illegitimate.
Yeah, I don't want to. If I heard you correctly, I don't want to speak to the Venezuela propaganda. What I would say that the level of information that Guyanese require by the government, the government is duty bound to provide information, because you have to do three things: inform, in order to motivate, and then to mobilize. So again, we're still in the information phase in terms of the government, and that is still, from as far as I'm concerned, that's below the halfway mark where the government is concerned. But more should be spent on information, of course, information dissemination, right down to the most ordinary person we can think about in Guyana. In fact, I saw a recent report where some Tushaus are complaining that they're not getting any information, they're not hearing anything. And these persons are living in Region 1. And if you have our Amerindian brothers and sisters who live in Region 1 claiming not to be hearing anything from the government, it is of concern because they are our frontline civilian troops. So yes, I think information is very important. A lot is being spent by Venezuela, but we have sufficient resources to spend more on information. But again, I want to make the point, it cannot only be the government. The government has to use all the means available to get the information out. Civil society, private sector, government, opposition, NGOs. We have to use all those facilities to get this information out. And the information that goes out must be sustained. It is after 62 years, we're dealing with this problem in the ICJ. 62 years. It's not going to take us 6 days to get it done in Guyana. It might take us another 62 years in Guyana to get this thing solved. I mean, after the ICJ decision in favor of Guyana, we still have to deal with Venezuela. So there's a lot of work we have to do going forward as a nation to ensure that our borders remain sacrosanct, that is safe from Venezuela crossing the border or trying to invade Guyana.
Well, I find, and I wrote this in an article that I published tonight, I find that the government is more aggressive attacking Afro-Guyanese citizens than the opposition than dealing with this Venezuela matter. It seems to me that the government believe that people like me and you and Afro-Guyanese people who don't support them are the bigger enemy than Venezuela. For instance, Malcolm Harry Paul just said, listen, you guys give all the contracts and all the benefits of the government to Indians, and the Afro-Guyanese and the GDF should feel a little apprehensive about going to die on the border. And he was arrested. Why don't they arrest Maduro? Why don't they go and arrest the Venezuelan agents in the country? So we are feeling, at least I feel, and a lot of people support my view, I feel that the government sees us as greater enemies than the Venezuelans. And so their approach is, for those of you who are speaking out, we will badger you, we will use the police to arrest you, we will intimidate you, we will persecute you so that you can stop speaking out, and the world won't hear anymore that we are incompetent, that we are racist, and so they will think that everything in Guyana is hunky-dory. How do we overcome a government that is so repressive, that feels that its own citizens that criticize it are the enemies when they're bungling and most incompetent with regard to this Venezuela crisis?
Again, like I said, it's a hard and easy question. Easy question that we have to change the government. I mean, I think citizens are coming to a point where they're recognizing that their safety and security, those two things are very important. And if you listen to the Guyanese, that's a main concern they have. That is safety and security. But I take the point about intimidation. And those security services, that's not the purpose. The purpose of the police is to protect. And I dare say that we're sensing a sort of colonial construct where the government is above the law, the police is the law, and the citizens are subject to the law. And that is a dangerous place to be. That's how we function as a colony. That's what kept us in check. So to an extent, the government is using that same colonial construct in management of the country. I know Malcolm Harry Paul personally. He's a former GDF officer. He functioned as a professional in the Guyana Defense Force. So that is my concern. But I have to say, however, that the Guyana Defense Force has a constitutional duty to defend this nation. It is not the only organization responsible for defense. It's the primary organization. So I would only advise my Defense Force brothers and sisters that you have to execute that constitutional duty. But that is underpinned by two factors. One, Article 33 says it is the duty of every citizen to defend Guyana. That's of the Constitution. So it's underpinned by that. So that's where your resources will come from, both private sector, public sector, the rich, the poor. And the government has to harness all those resources and bring them to bear in such a defense manner that the GDF can use it efficiently. And it's also underpinned by an active defense diplomacy. So the soldiers and officers there, that is their duty. I know how they may feel about discrimination. That's something I'm not going to put to the side. But we must not fall into the same trap to be accused of being unconstitutional in any way, the Defense Force. They're professionals. But coming back to the point now, which you raised about this, just for me, about discrimination, it is something that we have to deal with in Guyana. I mean, no matter how we turn, we cannot avoid it. We have to deal with it. And citizens have to be more active in dealing with it. I'm still appalled at not hearing sufficient pushback against the statement made by VP Jadvio against Kathy Hughes. I have not heard from many women organizations on this matter. And it is troubling to me because that is civil society. So we have to be very careful as individuals that we don't push back, then somebody's going to push us. And we'll have nobody to support us if we do that. So we have to take a stand in many of these issues. And that's what I would advocate. We have to take a stand. And the police has to understand it is a citizen-oriented police force. And its duty is to protect citizens. The rule of law is about protecting the citizens from excesses of the government. That is the rule of law. That is the underpinning, that is the essence of the rule of law. Not simply obeying the law. The rule of law, the concept of rule of law grew out of and still is ensuring that the citizens are protected from excesses of the government. That is the rule of law. That's what it's all about. So the government is subject to the law.
I want to come back to this GDF question because I am getting a lot of communication from GDF officers and or family members of GDF officers. And their contention is exactly what Malcolm Harry Paul said. Their contention is, and I saw a flyer to that effect. When you look at, for instance, all the people who get the contract, including GDF officers, all the people who get a contract and the people who refuse contracts. You have hundreds of black contractors who refuse contracts, though they're not qualified, but they're picking up grave diggers and social media hooligans and so on, and give them contracts, billions of dollars in contracts. And these GDF officers and their family feel that they live in a morass of discrimination, of repression, of oppression, and it is not being addressed. No matter how you complain and you ask the government to address it, it's not being addressed. The way they address it is by bullying you to shut up, hammering you, using Clifford Hicken and the police force to criminalize you. How can a demoralized, and they're going to say, oh no, the force is not demoralized, but you go there and you talk to the guys. How can you have a demoralized force protect a country, number one? Well,
unfortunately, we lost Sung again, so I couldn't really
get
that.
You want me to restate the question?
If we were to perhaps maybe pause if I can read it.
Yeah, maybe you can log out and log in back, and in the meantime,
log in back. I know the question started with contracts and all of that, but the rest I didn't hear, and I would be a loss to
right.
Answer.
So reboot and try to come back in because the audience.
Yes, in the meantime, and you can continue speaking to our viewers.
Sure.
Back in. Okay.
Sure.
Right,
okay, great.
Wonderful.
So while we wait on Dr. Best to come back, I want to hone in on this issue because it is not addressed. It is not being addressed. People in the GDF are concerned. People all across the country are concerned that this government is discriminating against people, African Guyanese, East Indians who don't support them, like Ubraj the Rhine and others, Amerindians. I saw an international report where an Amerindian community leader in Region 7 was complaining about discrimination, that the government doesn't engage them. I've spoken to regional chairmen in Essequibo who've said they've had no contact with the government. They've had no contact with the GDF. This level of incompetence is appalling. Appalling. There's a governance structure in Guyana. There's the central government, there's the regional government, there are NDCs and there are Amerindian villages in the hinterland. This government doesn't feel that it can consult, that it should consult with the local leaders. And just like they're not consulting with the opposition, these people think that they own this country. These people think that Maduro is threatening their little house out by Sparendam Seawall or Lenora Seawall. I mean, that's how they're operating, like if Guyana is their own cake shop. Now, I spoke about the absence of awareness from the government. We know Venezuela has the backing of Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, Bolivia, Nicaragua. We don't know who's supporting Guyana. This government has not sat and said, okay, or asked governments around the world to issue statements of support, warnings against Venezuela, to deter Venezuela, even before this Mickey Mouse referendum. Do Guyanese understand that this referendum has absolutely no bearing on Guyana? Absolutely no bearing on Guyana. Has absolutely no basis in international law. This is just Maduro with his little hocus pocus popularity contest that he's trying to engage in, calling this referendum to regain his popularity, to salvage his withering image. Excuse me, he is so unpopular in Venezuela. Do Guyanese understand that? Do Guyanese understand that whatever he claims to be the results have no basis, could not give him any mandate in Guyana? There's an absence. And there's also an absence of pushback from the government of Guyana in the international community, international press. When Dr. Best comes back, I'm going to play an interview of the president of Guyana in his pajamas, in something looking like a pajama suit, talking to CBS. I mean, these guys are shockingly inappropriate, incompetent, right? But then again, you know, I'm wondering if we really want to hear them, if we really want to hear Ali speak, or anybody, Jagde, or anybody from the government speak on the international stage, it would be embarrassingly painful for us, right? They're unpolished. They have a paucity of knowledge. And it would be painful for me to see like Bart or Irfan or Gail or somebody on CNN taking serious questions from serious journalists. Their unpreparedness. The president on CBS was stuttering. He couldn't. I mean, they can't elocute. They're not articulate. They're not. I'm not sure who's advising these people. Right. So I think Dr. Best is back.
Yes.
Doctor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you better now.
Loud and clear. Good. Let me play the president on CBS this morning, and then we'll come back at the back end of the video.
Okay.
Venezuela claims its citizens voted overwhelmingly in favor of a referendum that aims to take over an oil-rich region of Guyana, its neighbor. It's unclear exactly how many people actually voted, though, but both countries do have a long-running border dispute.
That's right. The Guyanese president, therefore, is calling on Venezuela to respect the process of the International Court of Justice as it reviews the land dispute matter. Just last week, the court ordered Venezuela not to take any action that would alter Guyana's control over the territory. You see it highlighted there on your screen.
So joining us now is Guyanese President Mohamed Irfan Ali to talk a little bit more about this dispute. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr.
He looks
President.
like he has on his pajamas.
Thank you for having me. Here we have a situation where Venezuela has long disputed this border, right? And it is currently being looked at by international courts. On the flip side, we know it's an oil-rich region. We know that Nicolas Maduro is facing an election in the coming year, and Venezuela is in the middle of an economic collapse. What do you believe is behind this uptick in this dispute?
Well, first of all, I want to make it very clear that the borders were settled in 1899. Venezuela and then British Guyana participated fully in the settlement of this border. They both agreed on the border. The border was then enacted in Venezuela, local laws, and also stamps were produced with the borders as it exists today. When we were about to get independence, Venezuela raised a controversy and the Geneva Agreement was entered into. In that agreement, it provided that if the controversy could not have been settled between the parties, then the United Nations Secretary General would determine the mechanism to settle that. And the mechanism that was determined by the United Nations Secretary General was the ICJ. And that is where we believe this matter must be settled. But as you rightfully said, Venezuela is faced with many challenges, political challenges, democratic challenges, and challenges within its society itself. Many believe that this is a distraction to what obtains in Venezuela now, but we are taking this very seriously because of the narrative that is coming out of Venezuela, the threat that comes out of Venezuela. And recently, Venezuela opened defiance of the International Court of Justice when the leaders there basically said they will not adhere to the orders of the ICJ. Now, this is an important issue for us in this region because we want this region to remain a zone of peace. We want this is an important part of the Western Hemisphere.
Well, Mr. President,
have
apologies for the interruption, but on your point, considering that Venezuela really isn't recognizing the ICJ, you're saying let it settle the dispute. You could see a situation where Venezuela goes ahead and tries to interfere in your efforts to open up leasing contracts for oil companies, oil discovered there back in 2015. This could escalate. What nations have voiced support for you, and what are you willing to do to defend what you say is your territory?
So let me just make a correction. Venezuela is saying that they will not participate, but Venezuela has already participated in the process at the ICJ because Venezuela went twice to the ICJ on the issue of jurisdiction, and the ICJ ruled against Venezuela, saying that the ICJ has jurisdiction to look at this matter. So I think the narrative that they're not recognizing or participating in the ICJ, that narrative is really one of a double standard because they have already participated in the process of the ICJ. They've already gone to the ICJ to seek a ruling on the jurisdiction of the court, and the court ruled twice in favor of Guyana. Now, we have had the OAS in full support of us, the Commonwealth Group of Countries in full support of us. We have had CARICOM leaders issuing strong statements. And we have had various leaders across the globe. I've been reaching out because our first line of defense is diplomacy. And we've been reaching out to leaders. The U.S. is strong support of Guyana. And also countries, India, we have raised this with India. We have even raised this with Cuba, countries that have a very close relationship with Venezuela, so that they can encourage Venezuela to do what is right and to ensure that they do not act in a reckless or adventurous manner that can disrupt the peace within the zone. But we are also preparing for the worst case scenario. We are preparing with our allies, with our friends, to ensure that we are in a position to defend what is ours that's secure.
So, Mr. President, just to piggyback off of Errol's question, what does that mean? What does that mean, putting yourself in a position to defend your borders?
It means doing the work in educating the world. It means informing all the relevant authorities and agencies of what is happening. It means constant monitoring and observation of what Venezuela is doing. It means ensuring that our diplomatic work is at its highest level because we want this to be resolved in a peaceful manner. It means encouraging the Venezuelans and the Venezuelan people, the leadership of Venezuela, to do what is right for the region, to accept a rule-based system, to work with the ICJ, to respect the outcome of the ICJ. And it also means to prepare ourselves, prepare our military asset in case of an invasion from Venezuela. We don't believe that Venezuela would act in this reckless way. But if they do act in this reckless way, we are already cooperating with friends within the region. We have defense cooperation with the United States of America. We are working closely with Southcom. So we are doing everything, first of all, to ensure that the zone remain a zone of peace. and to encourage Venezuela to do what is right and to abide by international norms and international law.
Well, Mr. President, we want to emphasize that point that you want to see a peaceful resolution to this. We all know people from Guyana and Venezuela and want to see this region of the world remain peaceful. We appreciate you joining us on CBS News today to discuss this important issue. Mr. President Mohammed Ifran Ali, thank you for your time.
What he means by defense cooperation with the United States, and why, if all of these people are supporting Guyana, to give the Guyanese people confidence and to demonstrate some sort of deterrence to Venezuela. Why haven't we seen, for instance, the Commonwealth Secretary General coming to Guyana making statements? Why haven't we seen the United States Secretary General or, Secretary of State or Ali here in America with the Secretary of State making these statements and getting these statements of support? Why haven't we seen the Prime Minister of the UK, the Secretary General of the OAS, the UN Secretary General? That's what could give the nation confidence. They're in some back room talking about, oh, we're talking about all these people and we're confident that we have a defense cooperation. Guyanese people don't know that. The country is anxious.
Well, indeed, the country is anxious, and Guyanese ought to be anxious. I said on a different program that the Guyana Defense Force in the context of Venezuela is prepared to defend Guyana in a particular context. But that is underpinned by defense diplomacy. The president mentioned diplomacy, but it's really defense diplomacy. And that defense diplomacy is what underpins how the defense force defends Guyana. And part of that is to how long it can defend, how long it can be engaged with an enemy, in this case, Venezuela, having regard to the fact of defense diplomacy, because it's a much smaller force. It doesn't mean it cannot fight, but how is it going to fight and for how long it will fight?
And just for the education, Venezuela has about 500,000 people altogether in their security forces, and Guyana has about 3,000 GDF officers.
Well, I'm not going to comment on the number you just gave, but it's more than that number you mentioned. But
okay.
What is important is how we prepare to fight a large country with a large defense force. And that is underpinned by defense diplomacy, not only diplomacy. So that defense diplomacy means that significant statements are made by international allies that give Venezuela cause to pause. And that is what has happened in the past, a cause to pause. On this occasion, there is no pause. Because Venezuela went ahead with the referendum, notwithstanding the ICJ's ruling more recently, which is a good ruling for Guyana, that Venezuela should not change the status quo at the moment, even though it claims that it's operating within its own national jurisdiction. Secondly, I would have been happy to hear the president mention that he spoke with the Russians and that he spoke with the Chinese, because those are two nations that have a veto at the United Nations Security Council. So I believe that would have been important for us to hear, that he's speaking also to the allies of Venezuela. Because, as you know, the Russians and the Chinese have veto powers at Security Council. I would have been happy to hear that he's speaking to Brazil, because he did mention he spoke with Brazil. He didn't mention it in the CBS interview. Is he still talking to Brazil? And that is important. So I think in terms of allies, we're getting more statements from opposition political parties
exactly
than from governments. Kamala Bissessa, opposition leader,
made a very strong statement last night. Yes,
the opposition leader in Barbados gave a strong statement, but we not
and Jamaica
statements, and Jamaica from the Caribbean leaders. So they're all under the umbrella of CARICOM. But I think Guyana should activate the RSS. We're a treaty member. I know I spoke about it before here, and you had mentioned, well, they're small forces, but it's not the issue of the size of the force. It's the issue of the construct that is there, the regional security system. I think we could seek to activate it, because it is a platform around which our allies can build, around which other international agencies can build, including the United States, because the RSS was birthed in with the intervention of the United States. If you recall the Grenada incident, that's how the RSS was birthed. So there is a platform.
But how can we have confidence in the RSS, which is based in Barbados, when the Barbados Prime Minister and the Vincentian Prime Minister have refused to expressly condemn Venezuela's aggression? they just prefer to say they back Guyana's case at the ICJ and that's it. They're not prepared to condemn Venezuela because they're depending on Venezuela for oil. So how can we be in a relationship in CARICOM when the CARICOM leaders themselves are not prepared to condemn this aggression against Guyana?
Well, like I said, I believe that the issue of the RSS I'm mentioning here is a very important issue. This regional security system that we're part of. And Article 4, I think, or 5 says an attack on one is an attack on all. I think it's a very important article, and I think we can build a coalition around the RSS that provide a broader spectrum of security for the Caribbean region, and more particularly for CARICOM nations. I look forward to seeing that developing as some of us talk about a CARICOM defense force in the region to help CARICOM to protect its national patrimony, its exclusive economic zone, and its internal boundaries. I look forward to that.
I want to know if Guyana made a strategic mistake in their filing at the ACG for the ICJ for the provisional order. They included something which, at a cursory review, to me, the court doesn't have jurisdiction over. It says they asked the ICJ to preclude Venezuela or prescribe Venezuela from the first, third, and fifth questions of their memorandum. And obviously the ICJ did not do that because they don't have the jurisdiction to do that. They can tell Venezuela what to do in their own country. It's a political thing. They could do whatever they want. It doesn't affect any international law. It has no basis in law. And the fact that it was not granted by the court completely ignored it because, of course, they don't have jurisdiction to tell Venezuela how to phrase some referendum. They have the jurisdiction to tell Venezuela, you can't violate international law, you can't violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another nation. The fact that the ICJ did not ignore this request give Venezuela something to say that they got a victory, that the ICJ refused Guyana's request in their propaganda to remove these questions from the referendum. Was that a strategic mistake?
It's hard for me to say it was a strategic mistake because I'm not fully seized with the strategy going forward, because there are legal strategies that the team would have outlined. Perhaps the legal strategy was to get an answer to one question only, which is question 5. Perhaps that was the strategy.
But then, in the other hand, you give Venezuela victory to say, well,
Venezuela is claiming a victory that is not a victory. You just said it's something national and could only remain national, so that's not a victory. I think the real victory here is question 5. I think that's what Guyana wanted, question 5, which purports to annex Essequibo, and that's the real victory as far as I'm concerned. The real victory here. I understand the issue you raised about the questions, but because I'm not seized with the legal strategy going forward of the Guyana team.
Let me ask you a different way. Do you think the ICJ has the jurisdiction? Let me ask you a different way. Do you think the ICJ, just generally, has the jurisdiction to dictate to a nation what should be on a political referendum?
No, on the face of it, no, of course not.
So why would they include that in a filing?
Well, you see, there's a point to make, and you're asking a very important question. Why would they do that? Because if I'm to speak to you legally, and I would say, let me look at the question again and then get back to you on it, because I don't have it before.
Sure.
You have an interpretation there. And I would like to, if I interpret it within the context of all the submissions, I can understand it differently from just simply on the program, right? But I want us to take the victory that we got from the ICJ, which is question 5, which was the most troubling of the questions for Guyanese, specifically speaking. In terms of the jurisdiction, Venezuela indicated all along that it doesn't recognize the ICJ, and it would not recognize the ICJ, but it reserves the right to go before the ICJ. That's a technical issue. The fact that the court has allowed them to go before it, even though it says it would not accept jurisdiction, is no fault of Venezuela. The court has allowed them to go there because the court is hoping that at some point in time they will accept the jurisdiction.
Well, but I don't think the court has a choice. I think Venezuela is just rattling nonsense. Venezuela can't say the court doesn't have jurisdiction because Venezuela is an original signatory to the treaty. So how can it say that it doesn't have jurisdiction? The main fact that it's a signatory, it accepts jurisdiction, right?
Well, there's a lot of propaganda in Venezuela, but you're aware that you're really under the law of the Sea Convention. Venezuela has a reservation under Article 15, which is to delimit maritime land boundaries and maritime boundaries. So Venezuela has not
it's not a party to that.
So on that, but they remember they've signed the UNCLOS, the convention, the Law of the Sea Convention, with a reservation, because if you have adjacent or opposite nations, then you use the equidistant theory to define those boundaries. That is what was used even before the UNCLOS. That was used by Schomburg to develop the line. And as you know, the line passed halfway between Ancoca Island, and Venezuela is still occupying Ancoca Island. So Ancoca Island now is fully settled by Venezuelans. So as we speak, Venezuela is still occupying Guyana. It's still an aggressor. It's still an aggressor where Guyana is concerned. And may I say, and may I just add that as Guyanese, we have to put into the narrative when we're speaking from the president right down. As I speak, Venezuela is occupying part of my country since 1966. We need to remind the international community about that and our own citizens.
Can we now, or should we now strategically, once, let's say after the ICJ has ruled, can we then move to the ICJ to require Venezuela to vacate Ancoca Island and to respect the boundary set out in the 1899 award? Should we do that?
Well, I'm hoping that in the whole submission and in the case, that will come out as part of it, something the lawyers will ask within the case, because once the court rules that the 1899 arbitral award continues to be valid, because it's already valid, it remains valid. The consequent question about the boundary becomes of no moment because the boundaries remain the same, and therefore Venezuela obviously will be asked to vacate that part. They have to be asked. I think it will come out from the pleadings in the case. But more importantly, this case we can get a decision in 2026 or 2025.
Correct.
Between now and then, it is important for Guyana's conduct is important. What is it we want to achieve as a nation? What is it the government should be doing? One of the things the government ought to be doing is to ensure, and we talked about this before, that first of all, we know exactly how many Venezuelan nationals we can absorb in Guyana based on Guyana's current resources, health facilities, food availability, and housing. We have to determine that number, and based on that number, we will then determine who can remain in Guyana as Venezuelan nationals with Guyanese heritage, who have refugee status, which give you limited rights, and those persons who can remain as economic migrants within the context of that number of persons we predetermine Guyana can absorb. And I think that is something the government of Guyana should do along with the opposition, not by itself, for confidence purposes. The other thing Guyana has to consider is after it does that, we have to consider closing our borders with Venezuela. This is a national crisis. And I tell you why we have to consider closing our borders with Venezuela. It is to prevent settlement incursion. That is what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians over the decades. Since 1948, Israel was declared a state. Look at the situation right now. We can have a settlement incursion by Venezuela in the Essequibo region, where Venezuelans come across, and maybe there's
is it already happening in Region 1, where we have more Venezuelans than Guyanese?
In large numbers, and have settlements in Essequibo, where they put down housing. And then the houses will have lights and water. If you have thousands of those houses going up, it's hard to uproot them subsequently. So I think I come back to the point that we have to ensure that we know how many persons we can absorb. We know who should remain as migrants, refugees, and those who should remain in Guyana. And this is a very, very important issue at this point in time, because it's also linked to our citizenship laws. It's also linked to reviewing and revamping those citizenship laws. So we're at a very delicate state right now, a very, very delicate stage. And I would say part of the solution is to close those borders, have an amnesty, and determine finally who should remain in Guyana based on a predetermined number agreed to between the government and the opposition. Again, the PPP administration alone cannot do it and is not authorized to do it by itself also. It should not give itself the authority nor be authorized to deal with this matter by itself.
I should let you know that my technical guys are telling me we have altogether, when I look at the studio numbers, we have 39,000 people watching us. So this is a very important subject. Let me ask you this. For the audience understanding, let's say the ICJ rules that the 1899 award is valid. How can that judgment be enforced on Venezuela? Let's say, for instance, if they ask Venezuela to vacate Ancoco and respect the boundaries established under the 1899 award, how is that judgment enforced? Who has the authority to now eject the Venezuelan soldiers from Ancoco?
It's an interesting question. As I understand it, the ICJ, the court, doesn't have a coercive arm, but the decisions are legally binding on the parties. I think at this stage we move into another phase. Which is how do we enforce the judgment of the court with the court not having a coercive arm? I think we rapidly, if we think it through, we rapidly will get into the realm of filing the matter within the Security Council. Again, it has to go before the Security Council and get a decision in its favor via the Security Council, and then call for partnership nations to ensure it work along with us to get that judgment enforced. If we remember the Kuwait situation, similar to Guyana, was an annexation. I had the coalition of the willing, I think, on the second occasion. But the matter had to go before.
So you're saying that Guyana would approach the nations like the UN, the Brazil, and the US, UK, Canada, etc., and they will send forces to help Guyana eject the Venezuelans.
No, I'm saying that we
pursuant to Security Council resolution.
Pursuant to Security Council resolution in Guyana's favor, and therefore means we have to negotiate with the Russians and the Chinese. They hold the veto powers in the Security Council. They're 5 permanent members. They have a veto power. So we cannot subtract from the geopolitical analysis, Rick, whether or not this is what the Chinese are fleeing to the east and attacking the west, whether or not this is another proxy war that the Russians are now setting up here in this part of the region. We as Guyanese politicians, we have to be very careful. The US is fighting a proxy war with Russia, and the proxy is Ukraine. And we have to understand, the proxy is Ukraine. The Russians could be now tickling Venezuela to have an incident with Guyana to fight a proxy war against the US, where Guyana becomes the proxy. It is not too far-fetched, because we see it as a part where Putin can believe or think that he has the advantage now with Russia, with Venezuela as an ally, to have some advantage when it comes to the United States in its own backyard. So we have to look at it geopolitically, whether or not this is not something that's being pushed even by the Russians and the Venezuelans at this point in time. So, and to that extent, they could veto Guyana's submission to the Security Council. It is a permanent member, so it's a lot of diplomacy is required. A lot of cut and thrust in terms of politics is required by the Guyana government. How adept is the government? How adept are our diplomats at this point in time? I am not sure, but I do hope that the foreign ministry can become more alacrity in the shortest space of time, because the confidence in the foreign minister is very, very low at this point in time in Guyana. And I say that unreservedly. The confidence in the foreign minister is very, very low, and he himself has recognized that. It's difficult for him not to recognize that.
I want you to listen to Eric Prince, who's a U.S. defense expert and the founder of the defense company Blackwater, which the U.S. government previously used as a defense contractor to help with issues in Afghanistan and stuff like that. Let's listen to his analysis of this Guyana-Venezuela situation and Venezuela's likely actions?
Direct interest in Venezuela, but certainly they got friends involved there now. It's hard to imagine they'll reapply sanctions.
Not even just the Biden family, but folks connected to the Democrat Party and the friendly hedge funds, et cetera, to go do the boondoggle. Look, Venezuela has enormous amount. It's probably the single country with the most oil, hydrocarbons proven in ground in the world. There's a reason it was called El Dorado, the city of gold, because in the days of the conquistadors, there's literally cities gleaming that have been lost to the jungles, but it's extraordinary wealth in the ground that has been just ravaged and damaged beyond compare by socialism.
If you were in a position to make such decisions, would you be supplying the Guyana Defense Forces? Would you be providing armaments from the U.S.? What does that look like?
They need armaments. They need the means to operate that equipment and to rapidly have a deterrent capability on the ground, in the air, and at sea, to up the transaction cost if the Venezuelans try something stupid.
So if we were wise, we would apply news. Let's look ahead, right? This referendum passes in Venezuela, as you said, and you sort of anticipate there's going to be some sort of incursions, based on some basic premise, right? Some false premise, and at that point, you would envision the appropriate U.S. response would be reapply sanctions, at least start to tighten them up
immediately,
instantly.
severe. Go right back to what it was.
Okay,
crank that down immediately. That may give them pause,
and then provide Guyana Defense Forces with supplies. Just supply them, military supplies that they could use. Maybe
a few things: some ability for mobility, some surveillance, so you can see who's making the incursion, and build and fortify some of those key towns. I would almost, I'm reminiscent of what the British Empire did in the Levant, and they built these Taggart forts, which are basically police stations that were little mini fortresses that could withstand an attack for a week. That's all you really need there, just enough to make it harder for people to roll in and take over.
Well, we're talking about oil rigs, correct? There must be littered across the region.
It's all well offshore. So you need a means to protect that from any kind of maritime nonsense, and then you need the ability to actually control land and protect infiltration from the Venezuela side.
Okay, so this is offshore rigs off of Guyana, but the excuse for this supposed dispute over the territory. Explain this to me? If Venezuela is trying to take back this territory, but the rigs are offshore, connect those dots for me. How does Venezuela get the
rigs are within the EEZ of Guyana? The land that makes that area part of the EEZ,
right,
is the land that is the Essequibo area that Venezuela intends to take back.
Okay, all right. So you've got offshore, you've got onshore.
Yes,
oil.
All this oil has been offshore.
Okay. Let's talk history again a little bit from the U.S. perspective. We talked before we were taping on the Monroe Doctrine. Give me your thoughts about how this alters the Monroe Doctrine. If we have a failed response from the U.S.
It's the nail in the coffin of any kind of Monroe Doctrine. Look, James Monroe was president in like early 20s, 23, 24, put out to say, hey, what happens in the Western Hemisphere affects U.S. national security. So all your European powers, stay out. This is our area, and if this is allowed to go on, it's further indication that the Monroe Doctrine is completely dead.
What is your prediction?
My prediction is through a irregular warfare approach, there will be an incident created after this referendum, and they will bully, cajole, pay off politicians in Guyana to even take a fall, and they will eat this. There's the arbitrage is so large that they're going to do something.
Okay.
And it will involve everything from money to full-on kinetic operations by the Venezuelan armed forces,
So
with Russian, Cuban advisors, and Iranian.
And Iranian.
Yeah, there's a couple thousand Iranian troops in Venezuela now.
On what basis?
There's supposedly a joint production facility for some drones where they make the Shaheeds. There's even been talk of putting some medium or long range Iranian missiles into Venezuela that could reach the United States.
So we've just big picture for a moment. We've got a war raging against Israel that they're fighting back against. We've got the Russia-Ukraine war carries on and will for some time. We expect. We've got obviously China, saber rattling constantly. We've got the crisis on our border that is basically, self-inflicted.
A flood that is not stopped or reduced in any way, shape, or form.
Right, because there's no intent to stop it or reduce it. So add this on as a new crisis in our hemisphere. It's hard to imagine this administration being able to address it competently. Am I right? It's not a good outlook, right?
Nope. And it's
all right. So for some analysis, first of all, I agree with most of the things he said there. I'm not sure that I agree with him that the Biden administration is incompetent and it had a feckless foreign policy. Obviously, I support Biden administration. But he made some very important predictions there, some of which I agree with. What's your take on his recommendation in terms of the type of defense hardware Guyana needs assistance with? And do you think Guyana has the capability of operating the kind of equipment and hardware he recommended without having actual American troops on the ground and pulling them into actual combat? Are you hearing me? Can you hear me?
Not hearing.
I just heard you. Go ahead. Go ahead. I just heard you.
I'm not hearing.
Oh, you're not hearing me? Wow. Guys, are you hearing me? Let's see if it's me. Audience, can you let me know if you're hearing me? So the audience, Gary, if you can hear me, why don't you boot up again and come back in?
I'm hearing.
I'm hearing you now.
I'm hearing.
Are you hearing me now?
You now?
Okay.
Yes, I don't know.
Were you able to listen to Eric there?
No, I'm not hearing you.
Did you hear the video with Eric's commentary?
I heard the video, and coming on to the end of the video, like the last 2 seconds, then I wasn't hearing. I heard the entire video.
Okay, so my question is, what is your analysis of what he said in terms of, he recommended, I agree with most of his analysis in terms of predictions, or at least I could understand them. I hope, I hope that, I actually believe too that Venezuela might take some action to, as you commented earlier, bring a lot of people into to occupy Venezuela, Essequibo. But I want to specifically ask you if you think the Guyana Defense Force has the capability to handle the type of defense, handle and operate the type of defense hardware that he recommended that the U.S. government should supply Guyana with, without involving American troops on the ground and being drawn into actual combat.
Well, I think it's the seminal question that is to be asked at this point in time, because you want to marry men and material, really, and that's the challenge. We married before and paired before, up to into the 80s and the early 90s. We paired before under the Warsaw Pact, with the Warsaw type equipment coming out of Yugoslavia, North Korea, Russia to some extent, and that's how we paired our equipment or personnel. That's how we were being trained. So to shift now to NATO type equipment a NATO type training, NATO type forces will take some time for forces to get back up to the strength and capability we had in the 80s. So Guyana has to decide exactly where it's going to go, because we no longer ideologically oriented towards the then Warsaw
USSR,
Eastern USSR and socialist and communist countries. We're now in the North American sphere. So we're talking about training, we're talking about equipment. So that is not going to happen in the short term. That is going to happen in the long term. And when you lose that expertise over a period of time, it's not hard to build it back. So I would say to the analysis made by the gentleman, it's not going to happen in the short term. It has to happen in the long term. We have to build and rebuild back to that point. It's like a pilot trained on one type of aircraft. You can't just put him on a different type of aircraft. Same thing with our soldiers type. We train on one type of a set of weapons. We can't just switch over to a new type of weapons. We don't use the M16. We use the AK-47. That's why we don't use the M16. So everything is technical. Everything has men and material training and harmonizing with each other. So it'll take some time for us to have the new equipment, training and expertise in the new equipment. So that is one of the important points to know there. And secondly, in the interim is what you may ask. What do we do in the interim? Again, we have to find the mechanism that means to cause Venezuela to pause, and that has always been important. He mentioned frontline and communities. If we recall, he may have read the PNC playbook. We talked about garrison communities. We talked about building the reserve around our Amerindian villages. And if you check the history, some of the earliest villages to have been titled by the PNC government in that time were the frontline communities. So he's speaking the right thing, but we lost that over the decades because we were spending too much money on defense according to the PPP at the time. But we were keeping the nation and the state of Guyana safe. We were giving Venezuela cause to pause. Now the terrain is not a terrain for conventional warfare. It's a terrain for sort of for guerrilla type warfare. So
right. I mean, and Guyana has situational awareness there, right?
We have situational awareness. It's our territory, it's our jungle. We know it. They do have conscripts in Venezuela. They have heavy equipment, but again, that is difficult for them. The other thing we should keep in mind also, even though the Brazilians are not saying it, but the Brazilians have deployed troops, increased the deployment of troops in the Roraima sector. And that's already a blocking operation to prevent Venezuela from getting into Brazil and then coming across into Guyana through Brazil, because there's a good road network there. But the Brazilians are there, and I don't think the Brazilians allow them to pass.
So other than
Brazil.
that, so that people understand, other than that, Brazil will have to come in from the sea, by some river, or by air.
Well, they could still cross, but they'll have to cross by boats, and it's become more amphibious, and they can't bring the heavy equipment. Other than that, they have to come in.
And you can see them coming.
Yes, you can see them coming, but again, I don't want to go too much into it. Strategically, where Venezuela will go.
Right.
But we have to be concerned that Essequibo is what Venezuela is claiming. And if you look at the topography, they may have to come beyond Essequibo to claim Essequibo, to get Essequibo.
Right.
So for people in Demerara and Borbis, we should not say that it's not our concern. It is our concern. It is our concern. We have to be, it is our concern.
So finally, before we wrap up, the National Assembly of Venezuela met today and they did some things. They established a high commission to defend Essequibo. That's what they're calling it, the defense of Essequibo. They appointed a general to be in charge of Essequibo.
Yes.
They appointed a committee basically to look after the citizens of Essequibo and ensure their welfare and social services.
Yes.
It's a bunch of bad people. You know what? Why don't they just send all the money? I'm from Essequibo. They should just send us money and we'll take it.
Yes.
And defend it against them too. We might use that money for the defense of Essequibo. But they're trying to take action to establish, from Venezuela to establish governance of Essequibo. It's all psychological warfare, and they've set up a headquarters for Essequibo. They've said that from today going forward, all maps in Venezuela should change to include Essequibo, and they set up a plan for the social care of the population, and they said that all companies that were given, and this is the thing, and this is their main contention, companies that were given oil concessions, they have 3 months to withdraw. And then they want to also establish something to recover environmental issues with regard to Essequibo. And they want to set up new national parks in Essequibo.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think Maduro, he has no choice but to go make the next move, and that's the next move, to make it sound as though this has been a plus and that he is prepared to do what he said.
But isn't that the problem? Is that how does he pull back after he is whipped up? How after he has whipped up all of this nationalism and claiming it's patriotism and fed the people with all this propaganda that they ought to go and capture Essequibo, and but most importantly, this thing has sprung onto the Guyanese population, to me, as a surprise. These latest actions. Do you think that we had an intelligence failure, and does that failure relate to the fact that we don't have a proper functioning embassy and ambassador in Venezuela?
Well, let me talk about the embassy. It is I think it's I want to say that I think it's a dereliction of political, professional, and national duty not to have an ambassador in Caracas, in Venezuela, the country that has an active claim against Guyana. And I would say so in relation to Suriname, but I know there is an ambassador to Suriname. It is also a dereliction of governmental duty also not to have an ambassador in Brazil.
It's incompetence.
When I reflect that for some time we don't have ambassadors in those two important border nations, one claiming Guyana, and one that is a traditional supporter of Guyana in terms of ensuring that tri-junction remain the same, it boggles my mind as to what the PPP was thinking in terms of not having an ambassador in Caracas and not having an ambassador in Brazil. So that is still a mystery. For me, I know you mentioned incompetence, but I want to go beyond that. It is a mystery. It's a political mystery to me. And I'm studying it. I'm trying to unpack it to see there's something more behind it. If there's something more sinister behind it. Because it doesn't make sense. It defies common sense that you wouldn't have an ambassador in Caracas or you wouldn't have one in Brazil. So that's what I wanted to say in relation to that. And it goes to the competence of the government, as you said. It goes to the fact of the extent to which Guyanese can have confidence in what they're doing. I think that is the challenge. We are not confident as a nation in what is happening. More so the persons who are in Region 1. And when you listen to Maduro talking about treating Essequibians and in a manner that as if they're Venezuelans, we have to be careful that money will not be crossing the border from Venezuela into Guyana to pay off people, to ensure that Maduro achieves this limited objective he's talking about.
That's my final question. Not only the people. You heard Eric Prince talk about Maduro might want to pay off government officials and so on. Given the fact that we have corruption that is so endemic in the government, and given the fact that we have this situation, let me play this last video and get your reaction to the possibility that this could happen. Do you have confidence that the government, based on this video, would be able to resist bribery on this matter? Here's the video.
Because I had considered, I'd been president for over 12 years. We had explored, in fact, I have explored several options internally. And for those who think, because you have some people now who think you shouldn't explore things even internally. Well, let me say to them that I was never that sort of president. And I will never be that sort of opposition leader. I believe in doing homework. I believe in studying every single thing available to us. I took the time and effort to do that, options available to us. But without making a determination as to which one will be formally put at the negotiating table. But a president needs to know all the solutions available to his country. and to look through them from the perspective of advantages and disadvantages. So we had done that. In fact, I had done that. And so I said one of the options that there was a view that we studied internally was, should we give this a channel to Venezuela and to the Atlantic?
That is troubling, and on many fronts. He claimed that, well, we noticed that this proposal was in Venezuela's submission to the ICJ. Jagdeo claimed that it was never submitted to them, but they haven't. The PNC is saying they never did that, but Jagdeo has acknowledged that he is the one that had this idea. To me, he is the one that proposed this to the Venezuelans without authority, without consulting with the opposition, without the authorization of the parliament, without a referendum to get the consensus of the people. What's going on here? So how could we not speculate that these guys might take some sort of pay and put Guyana in jeopardy?
Well, I didn't hear the last words you made, but I heard the beginning of the question, and I heard the video.
You sure you hear the last words I said?
No, hearing you.
I'm saying, how could we be confident that these guys wouldn't take bribe and do all sorts of things when they're acting outside of the knowledge of the people?
I understand the question. I understood the question. You played the video. I'm saying again that the video doesn't present a lot of confidence in the PPP government when it comes to the national patrimony of Guyana. It does not. And I don't know when the gentleman will walk away from it and how he's going to walk back from that. The videos are there. We had one when he was in casual dress. We have one when he's in official dress. And he's speaking there. But the point has to be made. The two things. One is either the Vice President Jagdeo was unaware of the constitutional duty and the constitutional provisions that says that no individual, only a referendum can change the borders in Guyana. Either he was unaware of that, or he's aware of it and decided that notwithstanding that, he's going to put something to Venezuela that he cannot function. That will backfire. It boggles the mind because, as I said, if the government is governing in accordance with the rule book, which is the Constitution, you wouldn't make such a mistake. Why would you consider internally anything to do with giving a passage to Venezuela when you cannot? Your government, when in opposition, you cannot do that because you need the approval of the Guyanese people via referendum to change those borders. And at no point in time was ever a referendum ever prepared or even proposed to come to the people of Guyana. So my question is, how was that going to be operationalized? He was going to sign something and say, here, I signed this on behalf of the people of Guyana. So I find it strange that he would have gone that far, but it's difficult to walk back what he said. And therefore, coming to the crux of your question, should we have confidence in a government that holds that position and that thinking, even though I noticed recently they're trying to walk back. I'm saying the Guyanese people should not have confidence in the PPP government to protect the national patrimony of this country. We're not sure what they're going to do. They're not upfront. And let me also make this point. The fact that he mentioned it, was it discussed with the opposition when he was in government, or was it discussed with the government when he was in opposition? If you understand the point I'm making, these are matters internal to whom? The government or the PPP?
The PPP, apparently. They own the country.
Well, a matter that concerns the territory of Guyana must be discussed with the opposition. I made a point earlier. If the government changes just like that, you can't bring in a new government that is not aware of decisions made about the country it is going to govern. So I see flaws throughout everything that was done by him in relation to Guyana's territory. It is not justified to say it was internal discussions And it is not justified to say that it had no effect, because the effect is what we're feeling right now. Maybe Venezuela felt we were at a weak point having these discussions. The other point I need to make is that the submissions always came from Venezuela up to that point in time, until we recognize that it was internally discussed by the PPP. So here we have historically the Venezuelans keep pressing Guyana, and this was the PNC government then, by submissions to get a pathway to the sea. The PNC said historically no, 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 right up to 1992. The document that is circulated now about that mentions, I think Dr. Barton Scott and others, is a Venezuelan document. So here's the PPP trying to rely on a Venezuelan document to accuse the PNC. That is absolutely ridiculous.
It's treasonous. It is and not only that, they're using Venezuelan submission to the ICJ to validate Barrett Jagdeer's arguments, which means that they have accepted Venezuela's argument before the ICJ.
Precisely, and that is very troubling. So all those years, we have rejected it, because as Forbes Burnham said, I'm paraphrasing, you can't give an inch, you'll have to give a yard. Now, post 1992, we're now hearing of internal discussions with a pathway to the sea. That is giving Venezuela a pathway to the sea. Internal discussions by the PPP, because we just heard the gentleman speaking that. So there's consistency with Venezuela asking for a passage to the sea, and the PPP discussing it internally to give them passage to the sea. So that does not provide any confidence to me and in me. I don't have that confidence. I don't think the people have the confidence that the government is and was prepared to really defend the patrimony of Guyana, and maybe trying to take the shortest way out. Let's give Venezuela a little piece of land and they will be quiet. Listen, appeasement is dangerous. We could wake up Chamberlain right now, the British Prime Minister who appeased Hitler. I ask him the question and he will say, no, I never do that again. He said, I'm going to give you just a piece of Poland, and Hitler took the entire Poland. You cannot appease a bully. You can't do that. Venezuela is bullying. He's behaving like a hegemon. He's behaving like an imperial power. And I would be bold to say that Simon Bolivar must be turning in his grave, because the headquarters that has been set up by Maduro to see Essequibo being part of Venezuela is in the state of Bolivar. Not the conqueror. So this imperial outlook of Venezuela when it comes to Guyana must be troubling Bolivar. It's
Maduro.
Right? Sorry, must be troubling. No, Bolivar in a sense. I meant to say it must be troubling Bolivar, the late Bolivar, who was in
right. No, I was saying in that regard, it's maybe not Venezuela being imperialistic, but it is Maduro himself with his ambition. Yeah.
Maduro himself. But mind you, let me just make this point. This is for 60 years, Venezuela has been doing this, and there have been several governments that were non-Maduro. And the same claim has never been rescinded. It is a political issue in Venezuela, and it's becoming a political issue in Guyana. And I'm seeing the beginning of the Venezuela-Guyana issue being used by the government politically for an advantage too.
Well, they're using these activities as political campaign. That's why they were excluding the opposition.
Precisely. There's no better evidence. The fact that they
all right, we've gone 10 minutes over time. Thanks a lot for joining us tonight. What an in-depth discussion. Thank you very much. We should do this again.
You know, we say an hour, we go for more than an hour.
We're here. The people are here. Just about 1,000 of them have left. We have a lot of people watching. Thanks a lot, Gary, for joining us. And we hope we can have this discussion again and a wider discussion on this topic. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Have a good night.
To your listeners. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.